Well, good morning again, church. Let's turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 21. Genesis 21 as we wrap up this segment of the Abraham saga, Faith and Fury. Genesis chapter 21. Well, they say that laughter is the best medicine, and no doubt laughing makes you feel better. When you've had a rough day, or you haven't been feeling well, or the weight of the world is on your shoulders, sometimes a good chuckle can give you that temporary reprieve that you need to keep pressing forward, and that's certainly a good thing. But can we actually say that laughter is medicine? Like it actually has a beneficial effect not only on our mood, but also on our physical bodies? Well, according to several studies, yes. Laughter, it seems, does in fact serve a therapeutic purpose. For instance, it increases our heart rate, our oxygen intake, and so apparently a person who laughs a lot tends to also be at a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Fascinating. Studies have also shown it decreases stress and anxiety of hospitalized patients, can even serve as a de-inflammatory for those suffering from rheumatoid arthritis. Humor therapy has even been found effective in increasing cognitive function in senior adults and in alleviating symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Moreover, laughter can boost the immune system, and mood-enhancing hormones can even lower pain awareness, promoting not only physical but also mental well-being. Not to mention, laughing seems to lower cortisol levels and promote muscle engagement. So basically, church, I think that means this, that we can eat as much as we want at Thanksgiving this year, as long as we laugh a lot while we're doing it. Y'all game for that? Does that sound good to you? All right, well, everybody, this is what I want us to do right now. Everybody, turn to someone sitting next to you. All right, go ahead and turn to the person next to you. Go ahead, do it. All right. Look him or her square in the eyes. Go on, let's go. Everybody look at them square in the eyes. This is what I want you to do now. I want you to make the craziest, most ridiculous face you've ever made in your life at them right now. And just laugh. Just laugh. Isn't that a great sound? Some of y'all didn't even have to make a funny face, did you? You didn't. It's just your normal one, right? But no, listen, laughter is a wonderful gift, isn't it? Which makes it rather unfortunate that Christians have the reputation sometimes of being boring, serious, fuddy-duddies, or worse, angry and bitter. People that don't know how to have a good time, because the truth is a miserable Christian should be an oxymoron. Because Jesus didn't come that we might have a miserable life or even a boring life. He came that we might have an abundant life. Indeed, God created a world full of wonders that He Himself took delight in, declaring it all good. He made us as His image bearers. He wired us to enjoy it all with Him. Now, that doesn't mean we won't face trials in life. Indeed, God has guaranteed that we will. But even in the hard parts of life for the Christian, there can still be joy. Because we know how the story ends. We know where this is all leading. And so we can laugh even in the pain. Not to trivialize the pain, but to remind ourselves that the pain is only temporary. Because in His presence, there is going to be pleasures forevermore. And even the worst parts of our stories, we're told, are going to work out for our good if we love Him, if we are called according to His purpose. And so the trial, it seems, is really just the setup for a glorious punchline that's going to be met with eternal laughter. And we get a taste of that this morning in our passage, because at long last, the glorious punchline has come for Abraham and Sarah. The tension has been building up for a while now, starting with a seemingly absurd prophecy that a 75-year-old and a 65-year-old would one day have a child. I mean, that just seems laughable on its face, doesn't it? Even in the ancient world. They might not have understood all the details of biology that we do today, but they knew how babies were made. They knew when they don't get made. Listen, 65-year-old women don't just pop out a kid, especially when they've never been able to get pregnant in the first place. If anyone other than God had been giving them this promise, they might have thought it a cruel joke, a horrible prank, a terrible setup. Because there's another kind of laughter out there, isn't there? A cruel laughter. A laughter at another's expense. I imagine that's the type of laughter Abraham and Sarah were most familiar with. Because in an ancient context where a woman's only value was horribly thought to only be her capacity to produce offspring, Sarah was probably mocked and ridiculed as one under the curse of God. So could it be that all of this was actually going to lead to blessing? Could everything that's sad could become untrue? Could the joy of children, the laughter in the home, at last be a part of Abraham and Sarah's story? It all just seems so crazy. And yet, they believe, stepping out in faith, hopeful in a God who made them a promise. But then years pass. And since they are still childless, they begin to plot and scheme, thinking in their own wisdom and power, maybe they could make this promise happen for themselves. Maybe they could name a servant as an heir. Maybe they could use Hagar as a surrogate. But this just makes matters worse, as trusting in ourselves always does. Indeed, with this last choice, they only invite more scorn. For when Hagar conceives, it says, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Sarah, the butt of jokes, once again, laughter at her expense, and yet this time, it was all her fault. She had created this terrible situation, and now she was going to have to live with it. But even still, God is gracious to Abraham and Sarah. Try as they may, they cannot mess up his plan, because God has made a promise. He's going to see it through. He is going to have the last laugh, telling them, you thought 75 and 65 was crazy, huh? How about 190? And at the thought of it, both of them find themselves snickering in disbelief. How could it be? How in their old age would they welcome a son? Nevertheless, if the Lord has said it, they believe it, because this is El Shaddai, the God of the impossible. Nothing is too hard for him. Even the old and barren one will bear a son. And the result will be, you guessed it, laughter. Laughter. Not in unbelief, but in the wonderful unbelievability of it all. And that's where our passage picks up this morning. Look at verse 1. It says, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. And the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised him. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Look down at verse 5. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. Not laugh at me, laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. It only took 25 years. Not because God needed 25 years, but because Abraham and Sarah did. Just like God took 6 days to create a world he could have made in a nanosecond as he formed spaces for life before filling them with life, so too has God taken his time with this sweet couple, preparing them not only to bring forth physical life, but to bring forth spiritual life. See, God wasn't just interested in giving them a child. He wanted to make them his children, beginning a work to reconcile a people for himself as they learn to trust in him. And no matter how many times they strayed, he remained committed to this. He was in it for the long haul, because no matter what, they were his people and he was their God. What a comfort that must have been to the Israelites who first heard this story from Moses as he was delivering them out of Egypt. Like Abraham and Sarah, they too left the land that they had known for the land God was about to show them. And all along the way, they too had fallen short of the glory of God. No sooner were they delivered through the Red Sea, and they too acted in their own wisdom instead of trusting God, constructing a golden calf to worship, and then rejecting God's command to take the land. They'd seen the mighty power of God on full display, and instead of obeying the one who is mighty to save, they shrunk back in fear that they didn't have what it takes. They too would have to wait not 25 years, but 40 years before the next generation would get to see the land. Not because God had rejected them, but because he loved them too much to let them reject him. And so even though they deserve to be abandoned, to forfeit the blessing upon them and be left to die in the wilderness, God had not given up on them because he is faithful to his word. He is faithful to his promise. And I'm here to tell you this morning that just as he was faithful to Abraham and Sarah, just as he was faithful to Israel, my friend, he will be faithful to you, even when you fall short. Listen, I don't know what impossible situation you find yourself in this morning, but I'm here to tell you the promises are true. No matter how far you've gone, listen, he hasn't given up on you. He will work out his purpose in you, and all you have to do is trust him. As ganked up as Abraham and Sarah were, they trusted him. And because they trusted in the promise, they were not only counted righteous by God's grace, they started to actually become righteous. Because listen, saving grace doesn't just pardon, it transforms. Faith doesn't just believe, it acts. Indeed, the evidence of genuine faith is obedience. And that's exactly what we see here. As God is faithful to his promise, Abraham again responds in faith. How? Through obedience. First of all, look at verse 3. It tells us that he obeys God by what? Calling the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. Right? God told him to do it. So he did it, but he doesn't stop there, because remember what else God instructed him to do. As a reminder that God is able to bring life where there is no life, and as a call to be holy as he is holy, every male in Abraham's household was to be circumcised as a sign that they belong body and soul to the Lord. And so again, in obedience to the Lord, it says in verse 4, Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. So we see here what a beautiful picture we have before us this morning of this loving couple holding their newborn son, the fruit of faith and faithfulness, of calling and obedience. And it's been 2.5 decades. But we finally see Abraham and Sarah receive their reward. At last, they experience some sense of shalom for the first time in Abraham's life and the first time since the garden, or at least since the flood. All seems right in the world. Sorrow has turned to joy. Struggle has turned to respite. Tears have turned to laughter. Shalom. But we're quickly reminded that the fullness of shalom has not yet come. Indeed, the ancient battle between the Lord and the serpents is still raging. Indeed, as they celebrate in verse 8, Isaac's weaning, which would have been when he was about 3 years old, which would have been a really big deal in an age of high infant mortality, we see that as they celebrate this, the laughter of scorn is about to enter the scene once again. Look at verse 9. It says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Now, whoa, you might be thinking, this sounds like that bitter rivalry between Sarah and Hagar from chapter 16 has flared back up, and some of that may indeed still be present. But listen, our English translation here doesn't adequately give us the full idea of what's going on in the original Hebrew text, because we hear the word laughing in this context, and we think, oh, it's just kids playing, right? But that would be a mistake on several grounds, because first of all, we're not talking about kids plural here. Remember, Ishmael would have been about 14 years old when Isaac was born. In Hebrew culture, that would mean he's no longer considered a child, but a man. Indeed, once you hit puberty back then, you were expected to start a family of your own. But if Isaac was 3 years old at his weaning, that would put Ishmael at somewhere around 17 years old, well into adulthood in the ancient world. But second, this isn't just an older brother playing with his younger brother, tickling him and making silly faces and cracking up in response, because the word translated here as laughter is more than just giggles. This is a mocking laughter. But okay, you might be thinking, it still doesn't seem like that big of a deal. I mean, anyone who has a brother knows that teasing and mild to moderate hazing is totally normal, right? Isn't Sarah overreacting just a bit here? I mean, boys will be boys, am I right? But it's important we note that the mocking laughter in this passage isn't just teasing. This is the same mocking laughter Lot's sons-in-law were described as having when they disrespected him and rejected the word of the Lord in Sodom. Likewise, when Potiphar's wife made a false allegation of rape against Joseph in Egypt, she accused him of doing whatever Ishmael is doing here. It says he mocked her. In Exodus 32:6, when the people are worshiping the golden calf, they are described as eating and drinking, and it says rising up to play. Same word. So we see here, usually when this word is used, it is not referring to an innocent laughter. This is a hostile and transgressive laughter, perhaps even violent in nature. So while we're never told exactly what Ishmael is doing here, it is clear that Ishmael is not just being a jerky older brother. He's threatening Isaac in some way. Indeed, in describing this episode in the book of Galatians, Paul charges Ishmael with persecution, most likely conniving to take Isaac's birthright as his own. After all, isn't Ishmael the firstborn? Shouldn't he get first dibs on everything? However, while God has promised to bless him, Ishmael is not the child of the promise. And so just as when Cain was jealous of Abel, whose offering was received by God, while his own inferior offering was rejected, so too is Ishmael now showing resentment for little Isaac, the child of the covenant. Instead of responding in faith to the promise, he is rejecting the promise. And in so doing, he is rebelling against the God of the promise, the God of Abraham and Isaac, seizing that which does not belong to him. But Ishmael should have remembered what his name means. God hears. God hears the cries of those who are being persecuted, even when they're only 3 years old. And he will bring justice upon the persecutors, which is what he is about to do here. Because Ishmael has turned away from faith, he is about to experience God's fury. See, Mama Bear Sarah's words might seem harsh here, but that doesn't mean she's wrong. This young man is a threat to the promise, whether by theft or by violence. And this shouldn't be a surprise, because remember the prophecy of what his character would be like back in Genesis 16? It says, he shall be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone. And so whatever Sarah's motive is here, we're going to see the judgment that she speaks is from the Lord. But Abraham doesn't know that yet. In stark contrast to his behavior in chapter 16, Abraham surprisingly doesn't just passively go along with Sarah's plan here. Moreover, we see that long gone are his days of being a deadbeat dad. Indeed, when God told Abraham that Sarah was going to bear a son, Abraham advocated at that time for his then only son, Ishmael. And here we see him do the same with Sarah. Because in verse 11 it says, the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. See, Abraham has learned not just to act according to his wife's wishes, but to actually act according to God's wishes. Last time, it was not pleasing to the Lord that he sent Hagar and Ishmael away. So Abraham was going to stand his ground this time until, verse 12 says, God said to Abraham, be not displeased of the boy and because of your slave woman. Isn't that interesting? God uses the same terminology as Sarah, showing that Sarah's instincts here are right. Ishmael is a threat to the promise, and now that he is a grown man, it is time to send him on his way. Now, that doesn't mean that God does not care for Hagar and Ishmael. Indeed, we're about to see just how much he does care for them. But he reminds Abraham this in verse 12. He says, whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Listen, God has been kind to Abraham. Even though he should have never slept with Hagar, God redeemed that story, even graciously allowing Abraham to raise Ishmael into adulthood. But now he has entrusted Abraham with another boy. And this boy likewise needs all of his devotion, not just for his own sake, but for the literal salvation of the world. It rests on the survival of this child. It's time to let Ishmael go. He is no longer a baby. He is a man. Therefore, God is going to treat him as a man, letting him feel the consequences of his actions. And that had to be really scary for Abraham. He loved his boy, but this too is a kind of love. It is a tough love. It's not time to coddle his boy in his sin. It's time to let God break his boy over his sin. That's exactly what we see God do here. Ishmael deserves his wrath. Even still, for the sake of Abraham, he will ultimately show Ishmael mercy. Indeed, he promises Abraham again in verse 13, I will make a nation out of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So just as Abraham had to initially step out in faith and go to the land that God would show him, so must he now entrust his boy to God to lead him to a land he will show him. So once again, Abraham is called to step out in faith, to entrust not only his future, but his son's future in the hands of God. And by faith, Abraham again obeys. Look at verse 14. Abraham rose early in the morning. He took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder. Along with the child, sent her on her way. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So by faith, Abraham has handed his boy over to the Lord, and now we see that his mother, Hagar, must do the same. Because as they wander in the wilderness, the bread and the water only last so long. Death feels inevitable. Indeed, Ishmael has collapsed at this point. Hagar can't bear to watch. And so it says in verse 15, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. This isn't the first time Hagar has found herself in this situation. She's been here before, and God met her then, when everyone else in her life treated her as dispensable. God reminded her that he was not blind to her suffering. He could see her. He could hear her cries for help. And just as God made a promise to Abraham and Sarah, God has also made a promise to Hagar that she would have a son. And like Abraham, Hagar believed the promise, called on the name of the Lord, obeyed the Lord. So Hagar too seems to be a person of faith to the God of Abraham. And yet, much like Abraham and Sarah, she found herself in a position in which it now seems impossible to believe in the promise. Hadn't God sworn that Ishmael would be a great nation, and yet here her boy is? He lay dying? This too feels like a cruel joke. If this is why God gave her a son, just to take him away? But God had not forgotten his promise. He had not forgotten her. Indeed, he sees Hagar and her boy. He hears them, even though this is exactly what Ishmael deserves, because he was the oppressor. He deserves the fury of God's justice, but with his dying breath, Ishmael, in brokenness, finally lets out a cry for help. This is significant. Listen, we often get in the way of people and the consequences of their sin, thinking we're helping when we're actually hurting. Ishmael had to feel the weight of his sin, that he might be set free of his sin and see his need for a Savior. And maybe that's where God has brought you this morning. Maybe he's been bringing you to the end of yourself, where you have nowhere else to look but up. My friend, can I give you some good news this morning? When you look up, he will be there. He will be there. That's what we see in verse 17. Listen to what it says. God heard the voice of the boy. Now, whether this prayer is a prayer of repentance, we don't know. The text doesn't say, but in response to the boy's voice here, God is going to extend mercy. Because even though Ishmael's sin is great, Ishmael too can be saved by grace through faith, just like his father. And my friend, the same is true for you. No matter how great your sin, there is a God who hears you too. There is a God who can save you too. And all you have to do is cry out to him. Call on his name. You are not too far gone. He is mighty to save. His arm can reach you. Because verse 17 says this, the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. So up, lift up the boy, hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. God makes the same promise to Hagar that he made to Abraham. But how will this be? Her boy is completely dehydrated, on the verge of death, and they're in the middle of the wilderness with no hope in sight. But has she forgotten who she's dealing with here? This is El Shaddai. Nothing is impossible with him. Even in the wilderness, they can't escape his presence, and the God who is present with them is going to make provision for them. Look at verse 19. God opened their eyes, and she saw a well of water. It was there all along. She just didn't have the eyes to see. He opened their eyes. And she went and she filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was what? With the boy. He grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Just like he did for Abraham, so too does the Lord provide for Ishmael. And not only that, Ishmael too, we see, will be fruitful and multiply, as he and his wife likewise have many sons, and he too becomes a great nation. Listen, my friend, God will always make a way when there seems to be no way. He did it for Abraham and Sarah. He did it for Hagar and Ishmael, and my friend, he can do it for you too, if you will turn from your sin and trust in him. Because just as Abraham handed over his son, so too was God willing to hand over his only son. Not just to protect the promise he made to Abraham, but listen, to fulfill it. Because Isaac's life and well-being were spared, he would ultimately have a son named Jacob, whose name would be changed to Israel. And he would then have a son named Judah. And from the line of Judah would come a king named David. And from the line of David would one day come the Messiah King, Jesus, the promised seed of the woman who would at last crush the head of that vile serpent. And even though we all deserve to be cast out like Ishmael, even though we deserve to be cut off from the promise of God, God's promise to you this morning is if you will call on his name, you will no longer be a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir according to the promise. Why? Because on that cross, Jesus took the punishment of Ishmael for you. He was cast out for you so that you could be reconciled to God, so that you could have a hope and a future. Listen, we deserve God's fury, but by faith, God has shown us his favor, because the promised child has been born. Unto us a son is given. And that's really good news this morning, church. In fact, it just might be something worth laughing about. Will you pray with me?